Good evening, Astros fans. Woohoo! We are deeply honored that you've torn yourself away from this very important game to be here tonight. Berthe, Morisot, and I, that is. I'm Helga Aurich. I am the Curator of European Art here at the Museum of Fine Arts, and it has been my pleasure to be engaged with this very lovely exhibition of an Impressionist that has sort of flown under the radar a little bit, but whose recognition, I think, is overdue. I would like, first of all, to thank the sponsors and supporters of this exhibition. It is the Kinder Foundation, the Rand Group, Mr. and Mrs. Lin and Anne Trammell, and all of you as members and supporters of the museum. So thank you. We bring to you an exhibition on Berthe Morisot, and we're calling it an Impressionist original, because indeed that is what she was. Let me see if we can advance our slides here. This is her, a very attractive young woman. She was born in 1841 to a very well-to-do Parisian family. Her father had been a high civil servant, and she grew up in very comfortable circumstances. She did have a little problem. Not only did she have two sisters who, like her, took up painting when they were in their teens. And it was, actually you see the picture on the extreme left is a detail from a portrait of Eve by Edgar Degas. The Morisots were very much in the circle of the Impressionists, and it would be Edgar Degas who will invite Berthe Morisot to join the Impressionist group in 1874. But we will go back a little bit. The three sisters learned how to draw and paint when they were in their teens to make a little present for their father's birthday. But little did their mother know what Pandora's box she had opened, because it became Berthe's great passion to be a professional painter, and that was a difficult thing for a woman at the time, especially for somebody in her social circles. Yes? The Morisots lived in a very beautiful area of Paris. It's called Passy. She never really left it. She traveled a bit, but she never moved anywhere else. She moved around there a little bit, but for the most part, her life was spent right there. It is the area, this is the Trocadero with the Tour Eiffel that's built a little bit later. Here is Passy. Here's the beautiful Bois de Boulogne, which will become one of the sites that she paints in quite a good deal. As you can see, a beautiful area of Paris, tree-lined streets, elegant shops, and she was very much a lady who belonged to the upper class of that area of the 16th arrondissement, which is still today one of the most fashionable in Paris. She trained with several teachers. The most famous of her teachers was Camille Corot, who was by then already an older painter, but still active. And he is the one who is so well known as a landscapist who had this particular touch of the silvery surface of his paintings. They are like shimmering jewels, really, the surfaces of his landscapes. And this is something I think Berthe had a great tendency toward and picked up from him decidedly. As you can see, she was much influenced by him, and it's very interesting to see that the first work that she submits to the Salon in 1864, she's 23 years old, is actually a sketch. And if you just pull up in front of your mind's eye the Monet painting of Impression Sunrise, this one to me is just as sketchy. She got hers in, Monet didn't. But as you can also see that in her thematic approach and also in the way she constructs her painting, she is very close to her teacher, Camille Corot, with the second submission that she sent to the Salon the year after, in 1865. I must say she got her works into the Salon a year before Monet did, so go girls. But as you know, they all struggled over the next few years. In 1868, she made a very important acquaintance. She met Edouard Manet, who was the enfant terrible, the out there, really audacious painter of modern life. He had scandalized the Parisian public with two paintings already before meeting Berthe. One, as you probably know, is the so-called Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which features a picnic group of two clothed gentlemen and a very naked woman, who is not a nymph and not a Venus. She's just a Parisian girl who took off her clothes. Scandalous, even for the French. The next painting was even worse. It was a woman called Olympia. The model for it was his favorite model at the time, Victorine Moret, and she displays herself in all her bodily glory for the beholder to take stock, completely unabashed and unashamed, and scandalized even the French even more. And he was really not an aggressive painter, but certainly somebody who liked to push the envelope, as we say today. He was also a very handsome man. He was also wealthy, from the same kind of social stratosphere as the Morisots, and he was the talk of the town. Well, when this young woman met Manet at the Louvre, where she was copying one of the old masters, it didn't take long for a flame to be lit. Manet found her extraordinarily attractive. And the first thing he did was to ask her to model for him. He was also a notorious womanizer. And she does agree to model for him, but her mommy is always there. Otherwise, her reputation would have been irrevocably lost. She sits for him for this figure here in a painting called Le Balcon. There are two other artists. One is a violinist, and the other one is another painter who's part of the group. And then if you look in the very back, very dimly, you can see the figure of a little boy. The little boy was Manet's godson. Well, that's what he was called. Manet and Morisot have, I think, a very interesting relationship over the next years. He paints her repeatedly, including in this very provocative pose called repose, where she is lying back, lounging on a sofa. She's fully clothed. In all of the paintings that he does of her, she's fully clothed. But it is extraordinarily provocative, especially the way the little foot peeks out from under her hem. And also, I think, he is very attuned to her ravishing beauty. There's these great big dark eyes, this beautiful dark hair. And we have a little problem here, because the woman on the right is another young woman who's making her way into Manet's studio. Her name is Eva González. She's younger than Berthe, and Berthe becomes incredibly jealous of her. Let me just read you what she says at one point. Manet exhorted me so strongly to do a little retouching on my painting of you. Oh, wait a second. Wrong page. Manet lectures me and holds me up to that eternal Mademoiselle González as an example. She has poise, perseverance, is able to carry an undertaking to a successful issue, whereas I am not capable of anything. In the meantime, he has begun her portrait over again for the 25th time. She poses every day, and every night the head is washed out with soft soap. This will scarcely encourage anyone to pose for him. Well, she was actually delighted that Manet couldn't catch her, González's face. He kept on having to retouch it. Every night he would scrape it off and redo it. And when you look at this beautiful picture, where she is seen as a painter at the easel, a very classic pose, the face is wrong. There's just something very odd about it, because it's been reworked and reworked and reworked. With her face, he never had a problem. Speaks volumes, I would think. And he paints her over and over again here in this beautiful small portrait with a bouquet of violets, which were her favorite flowers, and another very interesting one where she's hiding behind a fan. Who does that when you have your portrait painted? Very, very odd. You can't see the face, but you can see the feet. Again, very, very, I think, tempting. And then he sends her this little billet doux, this little sweet letter in the form of a small painting, her favorite flowers, with her fan, and a little it says, on the little letter, it says Mademoiselle Morisot, and on the bottom it says Edouard Manet. And you can't read what's in between, but I think we can guess. The problem altogether is that Edouard, who may have wanted to marry her, couldn't, because he was already married to a person that Berthe Morisot, who could be quite nasty sometimes, always referred to as Fat Suzanne. Fat Suzanne, poor Fat Suzanne, she was a little on the heavy side, and Berthe Morisot was extraordinarily thin and very conscious of that, had been hired by Edouard Manet's father as a piano teacher for the three sons. Suzanne Leenhoff was a gifted pianist, and as the English would say, fell pregnant when Edouard was 18. We are not sure whether it was his baby or his father's. Ooh, I know. He never acknowledged the boy. He never adopted him. He never gave him his name. He lived with Suzanne and the younger brother, and the boy was raised in the household. He had a last name of a completely fictional man. And in the end, however, the little boy inherited from Manet. He's also painted repeatedly. I showed you the one just before in the balcony, and here he is again, much later, when he's already almost about 20 years later. And as you can see, this picture is painted over a very long period of time. It started in '65, when Suzanne was still quite young. It's a year after they got married, but it is finished with the boy being painted in reading to his mother almost, 18 years later, a long time, 8 years later, a long time later. But you can see what a wonderful painter Manet is. This wonderful handling of both this black over here, and I'll have you remember that, and also these wonderful diaphanous whites that he can conjure up on his canvas. Well, that's the family story. He is a wonderful mentor to Morisot. He teaches her a great deal about how to handle paint, including this incredibly difficult pigment black, which is so very, very difficult to differentiate. But look what she can do, these wonderful diaphanous sleeves, the little ruffle at the neck, in this very interesting early interior scene that Morisot paints. I think it's 72. Really before she joins the Impressionist group. Actually, the group doesn't even exist yet. But you see here the real tendency of her to paint in this very loose and Impressionist manner. There is it is a very strange composition in the sense that this dark figure looms in the middle of the composition, dividing a very beautiful and luscious still life over here, this rather gorgeous muted gold ornament from a scene at the window with a nurse and the little girl. Morisot loves this transitional space between indoors and outdoors, this space at windows or just outside the windows, and we will see that occasionally again. So an interesting composition of a young painter very well handling her art already. Sometimes Mr. Manet could be a little obnoxious, shall we say, in helping Morisot with her painting. And we have a picture in our collection, this lovely young woman here in a light white and blue dress, of which we suspect that Manet may very well have painted at least part, because the application of paint is just a little bit different from the rest of the picture. Now, we know very well from this picture that Manet had a hand in it. And let me just read you the quote that Berthe writes about it. The next day, which was yesterday, he came at about 1 o'clock and found it very good, this picture, except for the lower part of the dress. He took the brushes and put in a few accents that looked very well. Mother was in ecstasies. By the way, the picture is the mother and the daughter of, mother and sister of Morisot. He took the brushes and put in a few accents that looked very well. Mother was in ecstatics. That is where my misfortune began. Once started, nothing could stop him. From the skirt, he went to the bust, from the bust to the head, from the head to the background. He cracked 1,000 jokes, laughed like a madman, handed me the palette, took it back. Finally, by 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we had made the prettiest caricature that was ever made. And then he had it sent off to the salon, so she couldn't do anything about it. She couldn't retract it because she didn't really want to submit it to the salon, but it gets sent off whether she wants to or not. So he could be a little intrusive. He was also the much more experienced painter, but as you can see, she really wants to hold her own, and she can. She's a beautiful painter. What we do see is that she is really very much at the cutting edge of where Impressionist painters are going. This is in 1873, a painting of her sister Edma, placed out of doors, en plein air, and certainly painted exactly where we see it. It is really a sort of a summer symphony of very, very delicate brushstrokes. The dress in particular is just diaphanous and shimmering, but so is the background, just very light in its application of paint and evocative really of a summer's day. It is something that really all the Impressionists struggled with, is to capture figures out of doors. Renoir is working at this at the same time, as are the others, as is Monet, for instance. It is something that painters in the past really had not done. Even if you look at great landscapes from the 17th century, 18th century, generally they are pastiches. The painters will go out into nature, draw from nature, then reassemble the parts in their studio, pose the people in the studio, and make one beautiful composition. And that's what they were supposed to do. They were supposed to have the imagination to pull something together that was then something new. The Impressionists are the exact opposite. They want to paint what they see. And that they are obviously criticized for this from time to time. She does another one, which I think is one of the most charming pictures in the exhibition. This one was actually sent to the first Impressionist exhibition in 1874. It's again her sister, who's now shown with her little daughter, and they're playing hide and seek behind this very small cherry tree. But as you can see, so intense in its color, yet sparing in its loose applications with a brush, that it just jumps off the canvas. Really, she is one of the finest painter in this Impressionist manner at the time, and it is no surprise that Edgar Degas asks her to join this breakaway group. She had, from the very beginning, wanted to be not only a professional painter, but she wanted to be an avant-garde professional painter. And with that, she's pretty much in a group of two in the world. There's one other woman in the group, you probably know her, Mary Cassatt, who's the American, but Berthe is the first one. She's one of the charter members of this group. She stays faithful to it throughout its existence. It more or less comes to an end in 1886 with the last exhibition. And she sends every year, every time there's an exhibition, she sends 10, 15, 20 paintings to be displayed there. The only time she doesn't is in 1879 when she's just had a baby, which also tells us that people like to send the most recent works. You wouldn't send something that was 2 or 3 years old. You would send something that was made within the last few months. Interestingly, we have this, the only pastel in the entire exhibition, a seascape, and she actually did paint quite a number of seascapes and landscapes, but she's mostly known for her figurative work. This little seascape bears a very interesting signature. Can you read it down here? It says Manet. It isn't. Somebody apparently applied this in the hopes of possibly making a better sale, because Manet was the much more recognized name than Morisot. But interestingly, whoever forged this never looked at Manet's signature because it doesn't look a thing like it. I have another theory, however. This was done in the summer when she and Eugène Manet, Edouard's younger brother, got engaged. Everybody in those families painted. Eugène did, Edouard did, Berthe did, her sisters did, in the end their cousins did. And this may just be a Morisot with a Eugène Manet figure in it. Could be. And then maybe he signed it. I don't know. She never used Manet as a signature on her paintings. Socially and legally, she was known as Madame Manet. But on her paintings, as a professional, she stays Berthe Morisot. The very intense relationship with Edouard comes to an end in 1874 when she decides to accept Eugène's offer of marriage. In fact, it was Edouard who had suggested this marriage already since 1871. He wanted to send them off on a trip together. Can you imagine? So they'd be so compromised that they'd have to marry, because he wanted to keep her close, but he couldn't marry her. And so he paints her twice more in 1874 and then never again. Interestingly, also in this last picture of her, you see her holding her little pinky up in a very strange manner, and I think it is to show the engagement ring. Sometimes, and as you can see here, a very odd painting of her. She looks very haggard, and indeed, she had just lost her father that year, and it is after, already a few years after, but she had suffered keenly during the Franco-Prussian War, and she was very, very thin at that time, and I think she does look a bit haggard, but I think maybe Manet is making her look worse than she actually did. This is what she looked like when she was married in 1875. She goes on the honeymoon with very good-looking Eugène, who seems to have been a very nice man and not minded very much that he was going to have to marry Berthe. It turned out to be quite a happy union. She painted, she kept painting all the time, and that was, of course, really had been her concern in trying not to accept any suitors where she had the feeling that they were not going to let her paint. Both of her sisters had ceased painting as soon as they got married. She does not. She isn't married until the ripe old age of 33. Her mother is desperate. So she's finally, accepted. She said she's the last one to be settled. And as you can see, it wasn't for the lack of good looks or even fortune that she hadn't decided to marry, but she really wanted to pursue this profession as well as being married. And that was a problem for women of her social standing. Well, off they go to a honeymoon to England, to the Isle of Wight in the summer of 1875. And guess what? It rained a lot. But there is this lovely portrait of her husband looking out the window toward the harbor of Cowes that you see from the hotel room, I guess, and it is one of the most lovely pictures in the exhibition. It's really small, obviously something, a little canvas that she took with her while traveling, but it is so bright, it is so diffuse with sunlight in the interior, and again, that scene between indoors and outdoors. It's beautifully constructed. You can see all the geometric lines that hold it together, but it is also open to the outdoors and just simply a charming picture. One of my favorites is actually this painting. It is one of the typical paintings that she does of women getting dressed, women getting ready for a ball, women at a ball, and of course that was her life. She was from this class that enjoyed balls and would get dressed and celebrate these occasions. This is a marvelous painting that she apparently worked on for about 5 years, so she didn't leave her studio for a long time. Interestingly, it was owned afterwards by William Merritt Chase and a little bit later by Mary Cassatt. Very interesting. It has, as we see this beautiful figure from the back in this gorgeous shimmery dress. We see a still life. We see the looking glass that she's looking into, and her signature is very prominent down here on the glass. And if you look very closely, you can see the outlines of the end of a bed here. What Morisot is doing actually is evoking scenes that were very popular in the 18th century. And I show you here a portrait also of a woman at her dressing table getting dressed, the famous Madame Pompadour by François Boucher. And you see the same tonality, this gray and pink and a little touch of blue that really speaks of the Rococo. However, the way Berthe Morisot paints is completely different. This is this nervous, light, delicate touch with these open brush strokes that leave a lot to our imagination. In fact, Berthe Morisot had a personal relationship to the 18th century. Her mother was a descendant of another great 18th century painter of Honoré Fragonard. So it may have been in her genes to have this leaning, or it may have just been a predilection. Interestingly, with her painting, we can't tell whether the young lady is wearing a dress, and I show you one here from a fashion magazine, or whether, like Edouard Manet's painting, she is in her underwear, in her corset. But it is this enticing falling down of a sleeve that is so lovely in her composition, and in particular, the way the shoulder just catches the light. It is the brightest part in the whole composition. She is well known for numerous beautiful portraits of women in formal dress. Generally, it's always very, very proper what Morisot does. This painting was sent to the second Impressionist exhibition, and I think it is a beautiful match. If you look at this painting that we've looked at before, to see how her still life technique, how she handles a still life in 72 and now in 76. She has become even more impressionist over these years, as you can see. It's also a beautiful match to a gorgeous picture that we have here from a private collection. And they're almost like two sides of a coin, if you will. The woman in white with a white fan and the woman in black with a black fan. As I said before, this is something, especially the handling of the black, is something that she really learned from Edouard Manet, who himself was a great admirer of Velázquez, the great Spanish painter of the 17th century, from whom he had learned it all. But a beautiful setting of these contrasts of the white, the dark against the white background, and the white with the black hair, and the dark floral back still life. Another pair that we have here, and very, very refined young lady here, the one from the Musée d'Orsay, who was shown at the 5th Impressionist exhibition in 1880. And this young woman here dressed for winter. And this is from the Dallas Museum, and it reminds us very much of another 18th century painting, which she probably knew very well. This is again François Boucher, a young lady with a muff. And it's so close in pose and in feeling that I'm sure Berthe took a good look, but the transposition into how she paints things, of course, is what is interesting. Just as an aside, I must say, in 1879 was the worst, 1879 and 1880 were the worst winters in the 19th century in France. The Seine froze over, it was bitterly cold, Paris needed to be rescued from the snow, and when the Seine had frozen over and was beginning to thaw, these huge ice floes made their way down the Seine. And if you throw your mind back a couple of years ago, we did an exhibition of Monet and the Seine, and these ice floes go crashing in to the bank at Berthe, and of course Monet rushes out and is thrilled to be able to paint this wonderful winter landscape. Berthe Morisot stays at home and paints a lady in a muff. Then in 1878, the end of 1878, the Manets, as they are known, have a little baby. Her name is Julie, and as you can see, she is much coddled. She is always in her nurse's arms, and for the next years, really, Morisot devotes herself to painting Julie and her family, and only the very closest member of the family, and occasionally a professional model. And we see this little girl literally growing up in front of her mother's easel, and it is absolutely delightful to watch her. This is a charming little painting, and it's not that little, charming painting of her husband playing in their garden with the little girl. And just the relationship of these two is absolutely charming, and the way these pink tones are then echoed in the background in these lovely sort of indistinct flowers. It's much, much better than the photograph. And she shows her with her nurse, and this is a charming title to a painting. It's called The Fable. Generally, it's only, a young girl or young girl with something or other, but here this is sort of an imaginary title, and it's something that actually Berthe Morisot didn't come up with, but her good friend Stéphane Mallarmé, who was a great poet and who was a very close friend. And I think it's charming to call it The Fable because obviously the little girl is telling her nurse the fable, so she has to sit up and listen. The little girl at the beach, they went down to the south of France, and you can see her here playing in the sand with her little bucket. Her favorite, Morisot's favorite color of sort of mauve and grays and purples really make the entire beach. In the back you see the famous Promenade des Anglais of Nice, a very famous and very elegant bathing spot, and always with an adult watching over little Julie. This is our painting from the Beck collection, and I'm sorry to say it has annoyed me for the entire time I have been here because of this watering can. I don't know where it goes. Is it in front of the fence? Is it behind the fence? Is it floating in the air? It really has annoyed me. However, here we have little Julie. Here is one of her little cousins, and the watering can. Maybe at one point we'll be able to settle that question. The only self-portrait by Morisot where she shows herself alone is in the exhibition. In all of the other self-portraits, she shows herself as the mother with her little girl. This is the only one where she shows herself as a painter, and as you can also see, in a manner that we see a lot in Morisot actually, with lots of empty space, lots of swaths of empty canvas. She just doesn't seem to think you have to fill everything. Now I must say this is also not signed, so maybe she wasn't quite finished with this. But importantly, as a pose, we see her here in the same manner as Rembrandt painted himself, as Manet painted himself, with the palette and the Malstick here, or with the brush in hand. And unlike Rembrandt, neither Manet nor Morisot reverse themselves. Rembrandt can turn himself around and paint the hand with which he is painting. The other two can't, so they sort of hide that hand. What we see in Berthe's painting is the mirror image, that we see what she sees. I love in this particular portrait that we see these prominent flowers on her dress, which at first glance look like decorations, like something, the Légion d'honneur or something that had been bestowed on her. And I must tell you that painters in the 19th century, especially in this period, they were lusting after medals. Medal was the thing they wanted more than anything else. You had to get your painting accepted to the salon, and then if you were really lucky, you got a medal. And they came in first, second, and third class, and if you got one, it was like the Good Housekeeping, stamp of approval, and the audience would buy your works. I don't think Morisot ever lusted after a medal. She just gave it to herself. And we continue to see little Julie growing up with her cousins, with whom she remained close all her life. This is a funny painting, I think, and they are actually fishing in this bowl, in this Asian bowl that had been a housewarming present from Edouard Manet. I'm sure he didn't intend it for the girls to fish in. And it's a very open and sketchy work, a little bit on the flimsy side, perhaps. And even more open is this charming one of little Julie looking out through a prism into the winter landscape outside of her parents' apartment. One of my favorites is Julie reading. She's about 10 years old here, and I find this picture is beautifully constructed, beautifully painted, and I want to be, I am just simply sucked into the imaginary world this little girl is getting from her book. I think it is absolutely delightful. You can just see her little mind being attracted by the text that she's reading. Julie grows up, gets to be a young teenager. This is actually her cousin Paul. I don't know, everybody in the Morisot family had boys' names for first names for the girls, but it is a girl, Paul Gobillard, and in a very different manner of painting than we had seen so far. As you can see, Morisot's style changes quite a bit. The flickering brushstrokes of the Impressionist years are over, and she paints in a much longer brushstroke, much more sinuous, much simpler. You can see the brushwork, but it is not as nervous as it had been. It is much more controlled. And it is actually something that we see here a great deal as well. This is Julie in 1893. She is in mourning for her father, which is why she is wearing a black dress. And but we see these long brush strokes everywhere here, in the hair, in the dress, also in the little dog, and in the surroundings. And it is a style, a manner of painting that we see particularly in this wonderful late portrait of Julie that Morisot had picked up from Renoir. The pose in this picture is, of course, taken from the very famous and terribly well-known print by Dürer, who made this in 1514. It is absolutely the symbol of melancholy, is to have your hand at your cheek and have this pensive look to. Stylistically, what Morisot is doing is she's actually looking at Renoir. Manet had died years before. Renoir sort of steps into being her mentor and friend with whom she's particularly close. He himself is going through a very difficult time in the 1880s and doesn't come out of it until the 90s. And we see his impressionist, nervous and light touch also changing into these long brush strokes. And this is what Morisot is picking up from him. Interestingly, what we also see is a hint of this, and that is, of course, Edvard Munch, who is the symbolist who comes after Morisot. Unfortunately, Morisot dies in 1895. She has nursed Julie through a bout of influenza, catches it herself, and passes away. So she dies at the age of 54. Here we see her in one of her last photographs. Because of her early death, I think we know less of her in the next developing story of art. Monet, Renoir all work well into the 20th century. She dies in 95. They only start selling well in the 1890s. She's out of it. She's not there anymore. Her family is not selling these things. And so her fame is not as pronounced along with the other male painters. So here we see her in just before her death. And very interestingly, Eugène and Berthe are buried together. And she is mentioned as his widow. And look who's buried behind them, Edouard. Fat Suzanne is nowhere to be found. Actually, she lived a whole lot longer. What does remain is beautiful Julie, whom we see here in a group of her cousins. And this is actually the daughter of Mallarmé, the poet, who was a very close friend of Morisot, and she becomes his ward because she's still underaged. Luckily, Berthe and her cousin Julie marries Rouard, also a painter, and her cousin Jeanne Gobillard marries another poet in 1900, and Julie has 3 sons, so the family continues. Some of the pictures in the exhibition come straight from the family holdings. And of course, we are left not just with a family, but we are left with this wonderful legacy of a painter whom I think it is worthwhile to get to know again, or better, or for the first time. Thank you so much.